Hi, everyone. Welcome to our introduction to genre. This will be our focus for this week, and this will help us to walk through the next few assignments or writing that we'll have an opportunity to do. So the title of this particular lecture is called Introduction to Genre, and it's Everywhere or Is It? And that is something that hopefully we will be able to discuss or talk about over the next couple of weeks. As you prepare for this particular lesson, you're going to want to make sure that you have something to take notes with, whether it be your paper, pens, pencil, or you have your split screen up with a Word document up. You will want to take notes during this. The information in this particular lesson you'll use throughout the rest of the module for this week, and then of course use the information to apply it to the different writing assignments that we will have in the coming weeks. So there are really just two guiding questions for this particular lesson. First one is, how is genre defined? And the second is, how do we know if something is a genre? So if you remember, we talked about or introduced these key terms towards the beginning of the semester. Rhetoric, rhetorical situation, genre, audience, purpose, media, and modes. And so what I want to do is I want to loop into specifically genre to see how it plays a role in things like rhetoric, rhetorical situation, audience, purpose, media, and modes. And so to do that, let's start with that first question of what is rhetoric. This is a quick review, but remember we talked about rhetoric as in the Aristotelian sense of observing any case of the available means of persuasion. So using language to persuade. We also talked about rhetoric as the effective use of language to communicate. This is one of the most widely understood definitions of rhetoric for today, meaning that it is how we use language to communicate. We also talked about rhetoric as the philosophy and process of making meaning. So, how do we use language in order to make meaning? And that leads us to rhetoric as the creation and maintenance of culture and social order. So, all of these things are indicative of how we understand this idea of rhetoric or the use of language. But now, what do we want to ask ourselves is, where do we see rhetoric in action? I think as we've seen across the semester that rhetoric is really everywhere. We've written discussion boards, we've written little reflective activities, you've written essays. All of those could be defined as using rhetoric, effective use as language. And so what we want to do is we want to take a look at this, what we call the rhetorical triangle. And these are the things that you consider as you write. You have the speaker or the writer, that's you, the person writing, and you come with your own lived experiences and context. You have the subject or the topic that you are writing about. You also have to consider the audience, who is going to be reading, who's going to be interacting with your writing or what you have composed. You also have the purpose or the intention. The why is this being written? Why does this need to be written? And then as you see in the triangle, you have these dotted lines of genre holding these things together. This idea of genre, of considering what that is and how it affects what we write, which is really one of the things that I would like for you to walk away with as a result of interacting with this particular lesson. But then specifically, what you're going to do with it when we encounter the next few writing assignments. So I would like for you to go ahead and get those notes out. Let's do some pre-reflective activities um, in order to just jot down where we are in our understanding. So I want you to just take a couple of minutes. When I get these questions up, you'll stop the video and just answer these questions. No Googling, just answer with what you understand now. What do you think of when you hear the word genre? So just maybe some words or terms or things or examples. How do you define genre as it sits right now? And in what ways do you think understanding genre can help you as you write? So, in other words, why would it even be important to have this conversation? So, go ahead and stop the video and just jot down a few things. You're going to use this later on. So, jot down based on these three questions. And then go ahead and pick the video back up and we'll keep going. All right. So perhaps a couple of the things that you may have written down on that first question of what do you think of when you hear the word genre? You might have thought of movies, of different types of movies that you've seen. You may have even thought about books or literature, different genres of literature that you have encountered or read, including this fabulously wonderful, very cheesy romantic novel with the cover uh, on it. And then perhaps maybe even some television genres, right? Such as this one, True Blood, which I actually haven't seen, but I understand it to be something of the vampire or perhaps sci-fi nature. So let's take those ideas and let's extend them just a little bit. And here's the section where we're really going to think about how we can construct this idea of genre through things that we're already familiar with or encounter. So, one of the first things I want to equip us with are some concepts to understand with regards to what makes something a genre. So, there's some terms that we want to understand. And the first one is this idea of genre conventions. Okay. And when we think of genre conventions, think about identifiable traits. In other words, genre conventions are all the little parts of the genre, such as similarities and repeated elements that audience expects in a genre, and it allows us to distinguish between different genres, such as, let's say, a horror film versus a comedy, right? There's different identifiable traits. And as such, each genre has different affordances. That means things that are allow us to take possible actions. And then in terms of writing, understanding the affordances of a genre will allow us as writers to take certain actions using a particular genre and how we might even interact with that particular genre. And along with affordances are constraints. And these are things that we think of that when we're working inside of a particular genre, um, those constraints include what is, quote unquote, not allowed or typically included in a particular genre. And as we walk through this, we can kind of loop these concepts in, conventions, affordances, and constraints when we look at this idea of genre. So let's play with it a little bit. Um, let's first use the idea of movies. Most of us are familiar, or that could be our go-to, the first thing you thought of, perhaps when you heard the word genre. So we're going to use horror films for just a second. Regardless of whether or not you're a big horror film fan, I am not, probably for the reasons that we're getting ready to talk about. However, I think they're a good place to start with this conversation. So the first thing we want to look at are what are the conventions or elements of the horror genre? In other words, what are the audience expectations? What does the audience expect to experience, feel, learn, see from this particular genre? So go ahead and stop the video for just a second and just jot down some ideas that you might have with regards to some of the conventions or elements of a horror genre. Once you've jotted those things down, go ahead and pick the video back up and we'll keep going. So let's take a look at some of the conventions of horror films. First of all, you have particular narrative structures that take place, things like death and murder, revenge, religious beliefs, survival, supernatural. So all of these are different narrative structures that you might see. You might even at this point even begin to think of different movies that would fall into these different narrative structures. You'll have settings that are familiar. At some point, you're going to have like usually abandoned or isolated spaces, woods, the house in the middle of nowhere, or the idea of someone walking down a dark alley in the middle of the night. These are different settings we are familiar with regards to horror films. It's those times when you see somebody running towards something that you just know is not a good idea. That's a convention of a horror movie or a horror film because they're trying to invoke specific emotional responses from the audience. When we think of conventions of horror films, you could think of lighting, such as low key lighting, darkness, lots of grays and darks, but also you'll also see some colors, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So you might associate some of the colors that you see, things like red, could be evil, devil, different supernatural or demonic things, blood, obviously. And then this idea of black or white, bringing to, the different fear or white, daylight, those types of things. So there are specific colors that you'll see throughout the film. And then, of course, there's the sound, right? Um, Thinking about the background noise, that creepy, eerie, or even dramatic background music or sounds that builds for the typical jump scares that you might see or in horror films. So these are what we would call different conventions of horror films. So these are the things that make up the genre of horror films, right? Um, when we look at some of the constraints, what they don't include, what you don't typically see in horror films, or what makes it not become a horror film. Um, you can think about those different elements because they are outside of, say, this bubble that we see on the screen. We could take that idea of horror and paint that brush across television shows, books, the movies that we just talked about. But where else do we see this idea of genre? So if we think of genre as having conventions, affordances, and constraints, I want us to expand our understanding of genre. So what about social media? Would you consider the different platforms of social media as a genre? Let's take a look. Let's run it through those things that we talked about. Let's talk about the conventions or elements. And I have the date there for a significant reason we'll talk about later. But March 21st, 2006 is actually the date that Twitter came out. So let's look at the conventions or elements of Twitter for just a second. Twitter is an online social networking website. It's microblogging service. It allows users to post and read text. 280 characters, known as tweets, are done about a range of subjects that afford users a quick way to get messages circulated. We call those statuses or retweets, pictures, links, right? So we've got this idea of what a tweet is, that 280 characters, which has grown over the years. It did not start out at 280, but it currently is 280. Another convention of Twitter is that you follow different people that show up on your Twitter feed. You also have followers, people who you encounter or engage with throughout uh, your Twitter. You also have usernames, usually, typically, or starting with the at and your username. And the username is something where you don't have to use your real name. You pick a screen name that allows you to identify as that screen name for people to follow you. Hashtags are used to find trending topics. So you'll create different hashtags in order to digitally categorize things. There's an instant messaging feature that allows you to take the conversation out of the public digital space and move it into that more one-on-one if you're reaching out to somebody. Twitter, one of the conventions of Twitter is that it'll allow for notifications. It'll tell you when somebody has retweeted something that you wrote. It will tell you when somebody has started to follow you. It'll tell you when someone has engaged with your tweet. So if we look at Twitter under the lens of conventions, we can see that Twitter is indeed a genre. It has these conventions. Now we could run this through the different social media platforms and see where they each have similar yet different uh, conventions, and yet they all do have conventions. They all are a genre of this social media platforms. So it does beg the question of what exactly is a genre and how does it come into being? How does a genre become a being or come into being, excuse me. So I want you to keep in mind that March 21st, 2006 date from Twitter for just a second. When we look at defining Twitter, or excuse me, genre, we're going to look at it through a scholar. Her name is Amy Devitt, and I believe that she has one of the more well-known or well-developed definitions of genre that we use in the field, and that is that genre is a dynamic response to and construction of recurring situation, one that changes historically and in different social groups that adapts and grows as the social context changes. Genres construct and respond to situations. They are possible responses that writers choose and even combine to suit their situations. So, what does this mean? Well, we all latch on to and understand this idea of movie genres or literature genres because these are what we are most familiar with or what we most discuss when we think of the word genre. But let's think about the social media for just a second. If we understand that genre is dynamic, meaning it's not static, it's not something that doesn't grow, right? It's socially constructed. How does it become a genre? Well, it's a recurring situation. Twitter became a genre because somebody decided to continue writing in those conventions, right? The horror genre became a genre because somebody decided to continue the recurring situation of those conventions. So we also see that it changes historically, right? March 21st, 2006, prior to that, Twitter was not a genre. Why? Because Twitter was not in existence and because it had not been used and then duplicated. We didn't have that recurring situation. So when I say that it's dynamic and socially constructed, it means that genres are ever evolving and ever growing. We don't get to this space where we have this is the exact number of genres we have, and here's what we don't know that, right? Because it's socially constructed. It does respond to situations. So think of social media. Social media in the digital sense. Social media has been along for a very long time, but in the digital social media world, what situation is it responding to? And it's this idea of having these conversations in the digital space, being able to circulate information, being able to interact with each other through the different platforms. So when we think of genre, I want us to come back to these concepts right here, right? This socially constructed, dynamic response to a recurring situation. It adapts and grows. It has conventions. It has affordances, things that it can do for us. It has constraints, things that it can't do for us, things that it's not supposed to do, right? When we think about constraints. So let's go back to the rhetorical triangle for just a second, because one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, what's the point? What can genre do for us when we write? Well, I think when we just looked at the Twitter with regards to writing, if you are writing in the genre of Twitter, you have those specific conventions that you have to adhere to. For example, if you wanted to write a 500 word post, you couldn't do that in the genre of Twitter. Why? Because Twitter constrains to 280 characters. And that is not a platform that whose audience is accustomed to that level of, let's say, blogging, right? They use the word microblogging. It's those quick uh, responses or quick posts of information. So genre in that sense, when you're writing in it, you've got to understand what those conventions are because that has a lot to do again with your audience as well. You've got to understand what your audience is expecting from that particular genre. Um, so when we look at this and the way that this infographic is constructed, we see that genre really plays a role in every aspect, right? With that intention and purpose, but genre is something that's considered throughout that writing process. The writer, the subject, and the audience or reader. You're going to see this when we start looking at different ways you can even represent some of the work that you've already done throughout our course with regards to moving it, let's say, to a different genre. So let's go back to your notes from the beginning for just a second. And because this is a video, you can always go back into the video to take a look at what we talked about. But based on this quick lesson, it is very quick, what would you add or change about the definition of genre that you originally wrote in those first couple of questions? And then how do you know if something is a genre based on what you understand right now? So just do a quick reflection on those couple of questions. Do a quick comparison of what you wrote at the beginning and what you're writing now. And once you have that done, go ahead and head back to Canvas to continue with our module. I want to thank you for listening to this quick lesson. Feel free to come back to it at any time and reference it as you walk through and apply your understanding of genre throughout. Thanks.